Thomas Hale, a weary Vietnam veteran, returns to his ransacked Detroit apartment, stripped of cherished memories, including his Purple Heart and late wife's letters. Unfazed, he quietly cleans up, drawing neighbor Mia Chen's sympathy. Her viral social media post exposes the theft, sparking outrage and cruelty online. Days later, the thief, Evan, returns, guilt-ridden, with Thomas's wooden box. Why did a hardened criminal kneel in tears before his victim? What secret did Evan uncover about Thomas's past that shattered his resolve? Discover the unexpected twist that transforms a crime into a tale of redemption. If Thomas's story of forgiveness moved you, join our community. Share this video to spread hope and support our mission to uncover stories that remind us kindness prevails. Hit that subscribe button and type "forgive" below. The apartment was a scene of devastation, as if a storm had torn through, leaving nothing but wreckage in its wake. Thomas Hale, a man of 70 whose face bore the lines of a life hard-lived, stood motionless in the doorway, his lunch pail dangling from one calloused hand. His gray eyes, steady despite the exhaustion of a long night shift, took in the chaos. Drawers yanked out and emptied, cushions slashed open with their stuffing spilling like wounds, cabinets gutted and their contents scattered across the floor. The small television, a gift from his Marine brothers a decade ago, was gone. The laptop his late wife Margaret had urged him to buy to stay tethered to the world had vanished. Worst of all, the display case she had handcrafted to hold his service medals, mementos of a war that still haunted his sleep, was stolen, along with the memories it cradled. Nothing of value remained, save for a splintered wooden frame and a worn-out jacket hanging limply on a chair. Yet 24 hours later, the thief would return, carrying nothing but guilt, and fall to his knees before Thomas, sobbing. What could unravel a criminal's heart so completely? Thomas's hands trembled as he turned the key in the lock, not from age, but from the relentless grind of working nights at the recycling plant. At 70, he still sorted through heaps of discarded metal and plastic, a job younger men turned their noses up at. The old apartment building creaked around him, its dimly lit hallways heavy with the mingled smells of boiled cabbage and sharp disinfectant. For 15 years, this had been home, ever since Margaret's medical bills forced them to sell the house they'd built their life in. The door swung open too easily, a subtle wrongness that pricked his instincts. Stepping inside, he was met with a scene of violation. The small space he'd carved out as a sanctuary was now a battlefield of broken things. His heart thudded, not with panic, but with a weary recognition. He had faced worse, far worse, in the jungles of Vietnam, where death was a constant companion, and in the hospital room where Margaret's hand grew cold in his. This was just another blow to absorb. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, no anger, no grief, only a quiet resolve forged by decades of loss. The neighbors gathered in the hallway, their voices a low hum of concern. Mrs. Petroski from 3B clutched her bathrobe, her eyes wide with indignation. "Tom, should I call the police?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and outrage. They both knew the answer. In this neglected corner of Detroit, where retirees and immigrants scraped by, the police had bigger battles to fight. A break-in here merited little more than a phone report, filed days later, if at all. Thomas shook his head, his voice calm but firm. No need, nothing to be done now. He set his lunch pail on a small side table, the only surface the thieves had deemed worthless, and knelt to the floor, his knees protesting with sharp pops. Scattered across the linoleum were photographs, torn and crumpled, fragments of a past he carried like a weight. He gathered them with care, his rough fingers tracing the faces of young Marines, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning into the tropical sun. Most of those men were gone now, lost to war, illness, or the slow poison of Agent Orange. Each image was a shard of memory, a reminder of bonds forged in fire and broken by time. Mrs. Petroski lingered in the doorway, her face etched with pity and frustration. "I don't get it," she muttered, her voice thick with contempt. "What kind of animals rob people like us?" Mr. Ramirez, peering over her shoulder, added, "You got insurance, Tom?" Thomas didn't look up, his focus on a faded photo of a friend who'd fallen in Da Nang, his smile forever young. "No point," he said softly. Premiums cost more than what I've got. One by one, the neighbors drifted back to their apartments, their murmured sympathies and promises to keep watch fading into the building's quiet hum. Thomas worked alone, his movements slow and deliberate, piecing together the remnants of his life. When he reached the bedroom, the true depth of the violation struck him like a physical blow. A wooden box, carved by a Vietnamese villager he'd befriended during the war, lay broken open, its contents strewn across the room. Inside had been his purple heart, earned in a moment of blood and chaos he still couldn't speak of without his throat tightening. There were Margaret's final letters, written in her graceful hand before cancer silenced her voice, and the dog tags of comrades who never made it home. Each item was a sacred relic, now defiled by careless hands. He sank onto the edge of his stripped mattress, the springs groaning under his weight. In his hands he held a torn photograph from his wedding day, Margaret's radiant smile now severed from his own by a jagged tear. His chest ached, not with anger, but with a deep, quiet sorrow. He could still feel her hand in his, hear her soft laugh as they swayed under the stars on that long-ago night. With careful precision, he aligned the torn edges and reached for a roll of tape from the nightstand drawer. No curses escaped his lips, no complaints, just the steady, practiced motions of a man who had learned that life rarely offers justice, only opportunities to endure. Thomas had given his youth to war that left scars on his body and soul, and his heart to a woman whose absence still echoed in his quiet moments. This theft was just another wound, another mark on a man who had spent his life sacrificing for others, only to find himself alone in the twilight of his years. The morning after the burglary, Chen stood hesitatingly before Thomas's apartment, her knuckles trembling above the faded wood of his door. Barely 23, she was the youngest soul in their weathered building, a nursing student juggling hospital shifts and late nights at a corner store to afford her dreams. Her life was a grueling balance of fatigue and grit, yet she'd always noticed Thomas, the old Marine whose quiet discipline seemed to steady the chaos of their shared hallways. His routines were unshakable, his newspaper retrieved at exactly 5:30 a.m., trash rolled out every Wednesday at 7 o'clock p.m., the American flag on his modest balcony raised and lowered with a solemnity that spoke of battles unseen but unforgotten. Their interactions had been limited to brief nods, glances exchanged in passing, but Mia had always sensed a story in him, a man who moved with the weight of a life shaped by sacrifice. Now clutching a scrap of paper she'd found, she felt like an intruder. But the urgency of her find pushed her to knock. Thomas opened the door, his face etched with a calm that caught Mia off guard. She'd braced for anger, for the brokenness of a man whose home had been violated. But his composure was unshaken, as if the theft was a minor ripple in a deeper tide. "Mr. Thomas," she started, her voice wavering with uncertainty, "I found this near the dumpster when I was taking out my trash." She offered a folded sheet, creased and smudged, but whole. Thomas took it, his weathered fingers grazing hers, and unfolded it with a care that felt almost reverent. His expression stayed guarded, but Mia noticed the subtle clench of his hands, a crack in his stoic mask. The paper was a letter dated June 17, 1982, penned on Marine Corps letterhead. A commanding officer's words leaped out. "You are the reason we survived that night." Another line carried a quieter weight. "The Corps will never forget, even if the world does." Thomas refolded the letter with meticulous care, each crease a silent act of reclaiming what was his. "Thank you," he said, his voice even, yet layered with a depth that stirred something in Mia's heart. She paused, then asked, almost against herself, "Was it important?" The question felt like crossing a boundary, but her worry for him and a spark of curiosity spilled over. A shadow of a smile flickered on Thomas's lips, gone in an instant. "It's just a reminder I was there," he murmured. "Sometimes that's all you hold on to." His words landed softly, heavy with the ghosts of memories Mia could only imagine. She nodded at a loss for words and slipped back to her apartment, his quiet strength lingering in her thoughts like an ache. That evening, a restless anger simmered within her. The image of Thomas's apartment, drawers gutted, medals tossed like trinkets, his orderly world upended, gnawed at her. She grabbed her phone and shared a photo of the devastation online, careful to keep Thomas anonymous, shielding the privacy he held so dear. She added a blurred shot of the letter, its details hidden, and poured her frustration into a caption. A thief stole everything this man had, but if they knew whose memories they took, would they even sleep tonight? She posted it, hoping her small act might stir something. Awareness maybe, or a path to justice. The post exploded overnight, racking up hundreds of reactions and shares. Many comments were kind, strangers furious on Thomas's behalf, offering money or help to rebuild. But others were venomous, their words cutting deep. Veterans always begging for sympathy, one scoffed. Why is he squatting there? Taxpayers would cover a nursing home. Another sneered, probably a scam for donations. Mia's heart twisted as she read on. Then came a video, posted by teens from the next block, filming Thomas's door with cruel captions, "Let's see if the old vet's got anything left." Their laughter echoed in her mind, a bitter reminder of how quickly compassion could sour into malice. Buried in the noise, one comment froze her. It came from a blank account, just a jumble of numbers, no photo, no history. If I was the one who took his stuff, I'd give it back. Would he forgive me? Mia's pulse raced. She clicked the profile, but it was empty. Newly made, no posts. Yet the IP address tied it to a 5-block radius of their building. Her mind spun. Was it guilt? A taunt? She saved the comment, unsure but convinced it held weight. Thomas, untouched by the online storm, pressed on. He fixed bikes for kids in the courtyard, his hands steady as he adjusted chains, his voice gentle despite their curious questions about the theft. He held doors for neighbors, even those who muttered about him. He waved off Mrs. Petroski's casseroles and Mr. Ramirez with a polite smile. His refusal a quiet insistence on self-reliance. His routines were his refuge, a way to defy the violation of his world. One evening, as she dragged herself home from work, Mia stopped dead. A car screeched past Thomas's apartment. A garbage bag launched at his window. It exploded, splattering rancid scraps across the glass. "Freeloader," a voice jeered as the car vanished. Thomas emerged, unfazed, gathering the mess with calm precision. He hosed the window clean, his motions deliberate, almost sacred. Mia watched, tears streaming down her face. His grace under cruelty felt like a call to arms. 3 days later, Mia posted again, not of Thomas's loss, but of his quiet heroism, snapshots of him fixing a child's bike, holding a door for a tenant with bags. Her caption read, "Some lose everything and still choose kindness. If you believe it endures, type believe." As she posted, Thomas sat on his steps, the 1982 letter safe in his pocket, his gaze steady in the dusk. The building hushed, its residents behind locked doors, but Mia clung to a spark of hope. Maybe kindness could kindle something, a step toward mending what was shattered. As the night draped itself over Detroit, its shadows pooling in the corners of the city, Thomas sat alone in his sparsely furnished apartment, clutching a photocopied letter. It was the last one Margaret had written, her words scrawled in a trembling hand before illness robbed her of the strength to hold a pen. The paper felt sterile, stripped of the faint lavender scent and tear stains that had marked the original, but her message burned as fiercely as ever. Don't forget to forgive. It's the heaviest burden you'll ever put down. Thomas traced his finger along the inked lines, as if he could summon the ghost of her touch, her warmth, her quiet resolve. Each word carried the weight of her love, her wisdom, her unshakable belief in redemption. A belief that had anchored him through decades of storms. The original letter was gone now, lost in the chaos of a burglary that had stripped his home of nearly everything that tethered him to a life once whole. The distant wail of sirens threaded through the air, a familiar hymn to his solitude, stirring memories of Margaret's laughter, her gentle reprimands, and the life they'd built together. Lost in the tide of memory, Thomas barely noticed the soft, hesitant footsteps approaching from the darkness outside. A figure emerged at the base of the apartment steps, barely more than a silhouette at first. As the dim streetlight caught his features, Thomas saw a young man, no older than 19 or 20, his frame gaunt, his cheekbones sharp under hollowed eyes. The boy clutched something tightly against his chest, his posture a tangle of defiance and defeat, as if he were bracing for a blow that never came. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the young man sank to his knees on the cracked concrete path, his head bowed. In his trembling hands was Thomas's wooden box, its lid splintered but its contents seemingly untouched. "I," the young man began, his voice cracking like brittle glass. "I didn't know who you were, I just saw an easy place to hit." Tears welled in his eyes, catching the faint glow of the street lamp. Thomas remained seated on the steps, his face unreadable, neither anger nor pity breaking the surface. He made no move to reclaim the box, no gesture to summon help. He simply waited, his silence an invitation rather than a judgment. "My name's Evan," the young man continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, tears carving tracks down his hollow cheeks. "I pawned your TV, your laptop. But when I tried to sell this," he nodded toward the box, his hands shaking as he held it out. "The guy at the shop saw the military insignia. He showed me an article online about you." Thomas's gaze softened, but his expression remained steady. After a moment, he spoke, his voice low and even, carrying neither rage nor condemnation. "Stand up, son. You're not in church." Evan stayed on his knees, his body rigid with shame. "I can't give back everything," he said, his voice breaking again as he lifted the box slightly. "But this shouldn't belong to anyone else." Thomas rose slowly, his movements deliberate, each step a testament to a life shaped by discipline and loss. He descended the steps and took the box from Evan's trembling hands, his fingers brushing the splintered wood with a reverence that spoke of years of memories locked within. Without a word, he turned and walked back to his apartment door, leaving it ajar behind him. Evan hesitated, his breath catching as he weighed the invitation. Then, as if drawn by some unspoken pull, he followed. Inside, the apartment was stark, its walls bare save for a few faded photographs. Thomas set the box on the kitchen table with care, as if it were a sacred relic. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to conserve energy, filling a kettle with water and setting it to boil. He placed 2 mugs on the table, their chipped rims a quiet testament to years of use, and gestured to a chair across from his own. "Sit," he said, his tone firm, but not unkind. Evan perched on the edge of the seat, his hands fidgeting, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting a trap. "I can tell you where I pawned the other stuff," he blurted, his voice laced with desperation. "Maybe you can get it back." "Stop lying," Thomas interrupted, his voice steady but carrying a weight that silenced Evan instantly. "The truth is burden enough." The kettle's whistle pierced the quiet, a sharp cry that seemed to echo the tension in the room. Thomas poured hot water over tea bags, the steam curling upward like a fleeting prayer. He sat across from Evan, the man who had violated his home, stolen fragments of his past, and yet here they were, sharing a table. "Tell me why," Thomas said, his words less a question than an opening, a chance for Evan to unburden himself. Evan's story came in fits and starts, each word dragged from some deep, raw place. He spoke of a mother lost to the grip of opioids, her absence a wound that had never healed. Foster homes that had felt like cages, each one stripping away a piece of his hope. A gambling addiction that had started as a fleeting escape, but had morphed into a relentless trap, chaining him to debts owed to men who didn't care for excuses. Each confession seemed to cost him, as if the truth itself were a blade carving through his defenses. His hands shook as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the table, unable to meet Thomas's steady gaze. When Evan's words finally ran dry, Thomas nodded once, a small gesture heavy with understanding. "I was 19 once too," he said quietly, his voice softened by memory. "Lost, angry, sure the world owed me something. But I had people who forgave me, who held space for me to become someone else." He reached for a notepad and pen, his movements slow and deliberate. He scribbled a few words, then slid the paper across the table. "I won't press charges," it read. "Just promise you won't steal anyone else's memories again." Evan stared at the note, then at Thomas, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if the absence of punishment was a language he couldn't comprehend. "Why would you?" he began, his voice trailing off, unable to finish the question. Thomas opened the wooden box, revealing a collection of medals, dog tags, and photographs worn at the edges. Because carrying hate is heavier than carrying loss, he said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet ache. I learned that in Vietnam, watching men die for reasons no one could explain. I learned it again when my wife died, when I had to let go of the anger to hold on to her love. Some lessons you keep learning until they sink in. Later that night, after Evan had left, his footsteps fading into the Detroit night, Mia, a neighbor from down the hall, took to the building's courtyard. She set up her phone for an impromptu live stream, her voice bright with conviction as she spoke to her small audience. Without naming Thomas, she told the story of a man who had chosen forgiveness over vengeance, who had offered grace to someone who had wronged him. Her words carried into the night, a quiet ripple in a city that rarely paused to listen. Thomas Hale's hands, roughened by years of war and toil, moved with a tender precision as he polished each item in his wooden box. The box, a humble relic of his past, held memories etched in metal and paper. Medals from his service, letters from comrades long gone, a faded photograph of a younger self standing proud in uniform. Each piece was a fragment of a life shaped by sacrifice, and as he wiped away smudges, it was as if he were tending to old wounds, his touch both reverent and deliberate, his lined face weathered by time and trials, softened with each careful stroke, a quiet resolve in his eyes. The world might have moved on from the wars he'd fought, but for Thomas, these objects were anchors, tethering him to moments of courage and loss that defined him. Unbeknownst to him, a neighbor's camera had captured this ritual, the lens lingering on the intimacy of his care. The video, uploaded online, spread like wildfire, touching millions with its raw portrayal of a man reclaiming dignity from chaos. Among those millions was a White House aide, a former soldier who had walked the same battlefields as Thomas in Afghanistan. Moved by the footage, the aide ensured a letter bearing the presidential seal found its way to Thomas's modest apartment. The letter's words carried weight, gratitude for his service in war, and now admiration for his example in peace. It spoke of two paths to justice, one through the law's rigid hand, the other through forgiveness that could humble even the most hardened wrongdoer. Thomas read the letter in silence, his heart stirring with a mix of pride and unease. He had never sought the spotlight, yet here it was, illuminating his quiet act of grace. The break-in that had sparked this chain of events had left Thomas's apartment in disarray, his possessions pilfered by Evan, a young man whose life had unraveled under the weight of a gambling addiction. In the weeks that followed, Thomas's world became a canvas for humanity's dual nature, its capacity for cruelty and its potential for redemption. Even haunted by his own actions, enrolled in a rehabilitation program, his thin frame bent under the burden of guilt. On weekend passes, he returned to Thomas's apartment, not as a thief but as a penitent. His hands, once tools of destruction, learned the rhythm of repair. He fixed the splintered door frame he'd broken, his movements hesitant at first, then steadier, as if each hammer strike was a step toward absolution. He repainted the walls, covering scars left by his intrusion, his brushstrokes a quiet apology. For Evan, these acts were more than labor. They were a lifeline, a chance to rebuild not just a home, but his own fractured sense of self. Mia, a nurse whose training had taught her to mend bodies, found herself drawn into Thomas's orbit as his part-time caregiver. What began as routine check-ins, monitoring his blood pressure, ensuring his medications were taken, blossomed into something deeper. She saw in Thomas a resilience that mirrored her own unspoken longing for connection, a family tie neither had realized they'd been missing. Their conversations, once limited to medical necessities, grew into shared stories over cups of coffee, their laughter filling the apartment's once empty corners. Mia's heart, guarded by years of professional detachment, softened as she witnessed Thomas's quiet strength, his refusal to let violation define him. The community around Thomas transformed in the wake of his story. Children from the local elementary school, their young minds captivated by a simplified version of his tale, declared him their building's guardian. They arrived at his door with crayon-drawn pictures and cookies that crumbled more than they should. Offerings Thomas accepted with a solemn nod, his eyes crinkling with warmth. Each drawing was pinned to his fridge, each cookie tasted with exaggerated delight, as if their earnestness was a gift greater than any stolen possession. The children's visits became a ritual, their chatter a reminder that hope could thrive even in a world that sometimes felt broken. Thomas's story, now viral, brought an outpouring of generosity, donations from strangers who wanted to replace what had been taken. But Thomas, ever practical, declined most of it. The few funds he accepted were funneled to veterans organizations or the building's emergency repair fund, his way of paying forward the kindness he'd received. One gift he did allow was a display case, crafted by a local carpenter, for his wooden box. It now sat in his window, where morning sunlight bathed its contents in a golden glow, a quiet testament to resilience. Beneath it, Thomas placed a hand-carved sign, its words simple yet profound. Memories aren't for thieves, they're for those brave enough to preserve them. The sign wasn't just for passers-by. It was a declaration, a reminder to himself that his past was his to protect, not to be stolen by bitterness. The local youth center saw in Thomas a teacher, though he was reluctant to accept the role. Attention made him uneasy, his humility a shield forged by years of service. But when they pitched it as a skill exchange rather than charity, he agreed. Soon he was guiding teenagers through the intricacies of bicycle and small engine repair, his steady voice explaining the value of patience and precision. For the kids, many of whom teetered on the edge of paths like Evan's, these lessons were more than mechanical. They learned that broken things, bikes, engines, even lives, could be mended with care and effort. Thomas watched their faces light up with understanding, and in those moments, he felt a flicker of purpose he hadn't known he'd been seeking. Evan's redemption was not a straight line. Thomas, true to his nature, sought no punishment for the young man. Instead, he wrote a letter to the judge overseeing Evan's prior offenses, his words measured but powerful. He spoke of the courage it took for Evan to face him, to return to the scene of his shame and make amends. The court, moved by Thomas's plea, reduced Evan's community service requirements, contingent on his completion of the rehabilitation program. During one of their now regular chess games, Thomas looked across the board at Evan, his voice low but firm. "Some debts," he said, moving a pawn forward, "can't be paid back. They can only be paid forward." Evan nodded, his eyes fixed on the board, but the weight of those words settled deep within him. At the community's Thanksgiving dinner, Mia stood before a crowded room, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. She spoke of Thomas, not just his forgiveness, but the way he'd transformed a thief into something more, something human. "He didn't seek vengeance," she said, her eyes glistening. "He chose restoration, and in doing so, he showed us what strength really means." The room fell silent, save for the soft rustle of tissues, as her words wove a tapestry of gratitude and hope. Thomas, seated at a corner table, ducked his head, uncomfortable with the praise but warmed by its sincerity. Thomas's apartment, once stripped bare, began to fill again, not with the same possessions, but with new markers of a life reclaimed. A refurbished laptop sat on his desk, a smaller television flickered in the corner, and books on mechanical repair and military history lined a shelf. But the photographs were what stood out most. One showed Thomas surrounded by the building's children, their smile bright against the backdrop of his apartment. Another captured him and Evan bent over a motorcycle engine, their hands greasy but their expressions focused. A third framed Thomas shaking hands with the mayor, an honorary citizenship award clutched in his other hand. These were new memories, filling spaces where old ones had been taken, proof that healing didn't require erasing the past but building atop it. For Thomas, some wounds needed no medicine, only the compassion to keep one's heart open. His story, once a private act of forgiveness, had rippled outward, touching lives he'd never know. In the quiet of his apartment, with sunlight streaming through the window and the wooden box gleaming in its case, Thomas felt a peace he hadn't known in years. His door, once broken, now stood open, not to thieves but to those brave enough to walk through it with hope. The memory of my first disillusionment with humanity still lingers, sharp and heavy, like a wound that never quite heals. It was a moment when the world seemed to collapse into itself, when every shred of trust I'd held in people unraveled, leaving me hollow and questioning whether goodness even existed. I was young then, too young to carry the weight of that betrayal, but old enough to feel its sting deep in my bones. The details of that day blur now, but the emotions remain vivid. The ache of disappointment, The quiet rage at being let down by those I thought were better, and the creeping dread that maybe this was just how the world worked. Cold, selfish, and unforgiving. But then there was Thomas. He didn't come into my life with fanfare or grand promises. He wasn't the kind of person who stood on soapboxes preaching about right and wrong, nor did he try to fix me with empty words or hollow platitudes. Thomas was different. He didn't teach morality like it was a lesson to be memorized. He embodied it, wore it like a second skin. Every action, every choice he made seemed to radiate a quiet, unshakable belief in doing what was right. Not for praise or reward, but because it was who he was. I remember watching him one afternoon, not long after my faith in people had crumbled. We were at a small community center, the kind of place where broken chairs and flickering lights told stories of neglect. A stranger had lost their wallet. Nothing fancy, just a worn leather thing stuffed with a few crumpled bills and a faded photo of a child. The people around us shrugged, some even smirked, as if the loss was just another predictable cruelty of life. But Thomas didn't hesitate. He spent hours searching, asking questions, retracing steps, his brow furrowed not with frustration, but with a kind of gentle determination. When he finally found it tucked beneath a bench, he didn't just hand it back and walk away. He sat with the stranger, listened to their trembling story of how those few dollars were all they had for the week, and offered a quiet smile that seemed to say, "You're not alone." That moment struck me like lightning. Here was a man who had every reason to be cynical. Life hadn't exactly been kind to him either, I later learned. He'd been through his own share of losses, betrayals that would have hardened anyone else. Yet Thomas carried a light within him, a stubborn refusal to let the world's darkness snuff out his belief in goodness. It wasn't that he was naive. He knew the world could be brutal. But he chose to believe that even in the face of cruelty, a person could hold on to their compassion, their integrity, their faith in something better. He made me see that no matter how much the world tried to strip you bare, your money, your trust, your hope, it could never take your ability to choose kindness. That realization didn't erase the pain of my earlier disillusionment, but it softened it. It was like a crack in a dam, letting a trickle of hope seep through. Thomas didn't just restore my faith. He showed me that faith wasn't something fragile, easily shattered by the world's betrayals. It was a choice, a quiet act of defiance against despair. He made me believe that even when everything else was taken, you could still hold on to the part of yourself that believed in goodness, that refused to let the darkness win. If you know someone who's teetering on the edge, someone whose hope is fraying under the weight of life's cruelties, share this with them. Tell them about Thomas, not as a saint or a hero, but as a man who chose to live with kindness in a world that often rewarded the opposite. Maybe hearing his story will be enough to remind them that they're not alone, that even in the aftermath of the worst violations, there's still a spark of humanity worth holding on to. It doesn't take grand gestures to change someone's world, just a single act of forgiveness, a moment of compassion that says, "I see you and I'm here." We told this story not to preach, but to share a truth we've seen lived out. You, by carrying it forward, give it meaning.